The mountain man emerged from the snowbank after 18 days, while 3 miles down the valley, frozen bodies were being pulled from cabins that still had fires burning in their hearths. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if frontier survival stories move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The settlement called it the freeze that broke the valley. For 18 days in January of 1844, the temperature in the Montana Territory dropped to levels that made survival almost impossible. Men who had endured a decade of mountain winters said they had never seen anything like it. Thermometers, for those who owned them, showed readings between -55 and -65 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, breath froze in the air before it could dissipate. Spit turned to ice before hitting the ground. Exposed skin died in minutes. And on January 22nd, when the cold finally broke and the temperature climbed back to an almost pleasant -10 degrees, Thomas Brennan emerged from a snowbank 3 miles outside the settlement, walked calmly into the trading post, and asked if anyone had coffee to spare. The men gathered around the fire stared at him like he was a ghost. Thomas looked healthy. His cheeks showed color. His fingers moved normally. He showed no signs of frostbite, no blackened toes or nose, no shivering or confusion. He had spent 18 days in conditions that had killed 7 men and left 12 others permanently maimed, and he looked like he had just finished a pleasant morning walk. William Crawford, who ran the trading post, was the first to speak. He asked Thomas where he had been. Thomas told him he had been in his winter shelter. Crawford pointed out that everyone knew Thomas's cabin was 15 miles north, too far to reach in the killing cold. Thomas agreed. He said he had not been in his cabin, he had been in the snow. The other men thought he was confused or lying. Robert Kimball, who had lost 3 toes to frostbite during the freeze, demanded to know what Thomas meant. Thomas explained calmly that he had spent the 18 days in a tunnel he had dug into a snowdrift back in December. The men exchanged glances. Several laughed nervously. Marcus Webb, whose brother had frozen to death on day 6 of the cold, despite having a roaring fire in his cabin, stood up and accused Thomas of making a cruel joke. Thomas was not joking. He described the tunnel in technical detail. He explained how he had reinforced the entrance with wooden beams and vertical saplings, how he had layered the roof with logs and branches and animal hides and moss, how the tunnel extended more than 20 feet into the accumulated snowpack. He told them the interior temperature had stayed between 32 and 40 degrees the entire time, maintained by nothing more than his body heat and the insulating properties of the snow itself. He had used no fire. He had burned no wood. He had simply waited in the darkness while men 3 miles away died beside their hearths. Thomas Brennan arrived in the Montana Territory in the autumn of 1835 at the age of 23. He came west from Pennsylvania with basic carpentry skills, a decent rifle, and enough sense to listen more than he talked. The fur trade was already past its peak by then, but men could still make a living trapping beaver and marten if they worked hard and survived the winters. Thomas proved competent at both. By 1843, he had completed 9 seasons in the mountains. He knew how to read weather, how to find game when others went hungry, and how to build shelters that kept out wind and rain. Other trappers respected him as solid and reliable, neither reckless nor timid. The small settlement where Thomas traded his furs sat in a narrow valley along the Bitterroot River. 15 families and unmarried trappers lived there year-round. The settlement had a trading post, a blacksmith, and enough sense of community that people helped each other during hard times. It was not much, but it was civilization of a sort, a place where men could resupply, share information, and remember they were not entirely alone in the wilderness. Thomas kept a cabin 15 miles north of the settlement, close to good trapping territory but far enough away to avoid competition with other trappers. He spent most of his time alone, which suited him fine. In the autumn of 1843, Thomas took on a partner. Jakob Morse was a German immigrant, 26 years old, who had arrived in the territory that spring with more enthusiasm than experience. He needed someone to teach him the trapping trade. Thomas needed help working his lines and processing pelts. The arrangement made practical sense. They built a second sleeping platform in Thomas's cabin and spent September and October preparing for winter. They cut firewood, repaired equipment, scouted trap locations, and laid in supplies of dried meat and flour. Jakob was strong and willing to learn. He listened to Thomas's instructions and did not complain about the long hours of physical work. The first snow came in early November, which was normal for that elevation. The two men began running their trap lines, checking each one every 3 days, collecting beaver and marten pelts, and resetting the traps. The work was cold and monotonous, but the catch was decent. By mid-November, they had 43 pelts stretched and drying in the cabin. Thomas estimated they would have a profitable season if they could maintain that pace through February. The weather stayed cold, but manageable. The snow depth increased steadily, reaching about 2 feet on flat ground by the 3rd week of November. Everything seemed routine. Thomas had no reason to think this winter would be different from the previous 9 he had survived. He had no way of knowing that. In less than a month, Jakob would be dead, and Thomas's understanding of winter survival would be completely overturned. The blizzard arrived on November 23rd without warning. Thomas and Jakob had left the cabin at dawn to check their northern trap line, a circuit that normally took 6 hours to complete. The sky was clear when they started. By mid-morning, clouds had moved in from the northwest, and the temperature began dropping rapidly. Thomas recognized the signs of a serious storm building. He told Jakob they needed to head back immediately, abandoning the unchecked traps. They were approximately 2 miles from the cabin when the wind hit. Within minutes, visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Snow came horizontally, driven by winds that Thomas estimated at 40 or 50 miles per hour. The temperature plummeted. Thomas tried to navigate by landmarks he knew, but the whiteout conditions made everything unrecognizable. He kept Jakob close, shouting instructions over the wind. They moved slowly, testing each step, trying to maintain their sense of direction. What should have been a 40-minute walk stretched into 2 hours of stumbling through chest-deep drifts. Jakob began falling behind. Thomas would stop, wait for him to catch up, then continue. The younger man was struggling. His movements became slower and less coordinated. When they finally reached the cabin, both men were dangerously cold. Thomas got the door open and pushed Jakob inside. He built up the fire quickly, using dry kindling he kept stored for emergencies. The flames grew, filling the small space with heat and light. Thomas stripped off his wet outer layers and helped Jakob do the same. He wrapped them both in dry blankets and positioned them close to the fire. He melted snow for water and made Jakob drink. He did everything correctly, following every procedure he knew for treating cold exposure. But Jakob was not recovering. His shivering had stopped, which Thomas knew was a bad sign. The younger man seemed confused, speaking in German, not recognizing where he was. Thomas kept the fire burning hot. The cabin warmed to a temperature that would normally be comfortable. But Jakob's condition continued to deteriorate. By midnight, he was unconscious. By dawn on November 24th, he was dead. Thomas sat beside the body for several hours, keeping the fire going, trying to understand what had happened. Jakob had not frozen to death in the snow. He had died inside a heated cabin, wrapped in blankets, with a roaring fire less than 6 feet away. The cabin had not been enough. The fire had not been enough. Thomas had done everything mountain men were supposed to do in that situation, and his partner had died anyway. That realization changed something fundamental in how Thomas thought about winter survival. If a cabin and fire could not save a man from the cold, then perhaps cabins and fires were not the answer. Thomas buried Jakob on a hillside overlooking the valley on November 26th. The ground was frozen, so he piled stones over the shallow grave to protect it from animals. He marked it with a wooden cross carved from a split log and returned to his cabin alone. Other trappers would have mourned for a few days, then returned to work. The mountains demanded practical thinking. Death was common. Dwelling on it served no purpose. But Thomas could not let it go. He kept returning to the same question: why had Jakob died in a heated cabin while they both had survived hours in the blizzard? The answer seemed obvious at first. Jakob had been exposed longer, gotten colder, could not recover. But that explanation did not satisfy Thomas. Something about it felt incomplete. He began paying attention to how animals survived winter. In early December, during his trapline rounds, he noticed a fox disappear into a snowbank. He approached carefully and found a small entrance tunnel leading into the accumulated snow. The fox had created a den. Inside the drift, Thomas knelt and felt the air coming from the entrance. It was noticeably warmer than the outside air, even though there was obviously no fire inside. He found similar dens created by rabbits and other small animals. They were surviving inside the snow, not despite it. That observation started Thomas thinking in a different direction. He began experimenting with snow. He dug small holes and measured the temperature inside them compared to the outside air. He discovered that even a few feet into a snowbank, the temperature stabilized around 30 to 35 degrees, regardless of how cold the air above was. On nights when the surface temperature dropped to -20, the interior of the snowbank remained near freezing. Snow, he realized, was not just frozen water, it was insulation. The air trapped between ice crystals created barriers that prevented heat from moving. The deeper into the snow, the more stable the temperature became. Animals understood this, instinctively. They used snow as shelter, not something to escape from. The other trappers noticed Thomas's strange behavior. He spent hours studying snowdrifts, digging test holes, measuring depths with marked poles. He neglected his trap lines. When he came to the settlement for supplies in mid-December, men asked what he was doing. Thomas tried to explain his observations about snow and insulation and stable temperatures. They listened politely but clearly thought grief had affected his mind. Marcus Webb suggested Thomas should spend less time alone. Robert Kimball joked that Thomas was becoming part animal, studying dens like he wanted to live in one. William Crawford offered genuine concern, asking if Thomas needed anything, implying help of the medical or spiritual variety. Thomas stopped trying to explain. He bought supplies, returned to his cabin, and continued his research privately. By late December, he had a theory he wanted to test. Snow could provide better shelter than a cabin if properly used. He just needed to prove it. Thomas selected his test site in the first week of December. About half a mile from his cabin, a massive snowdrift had accumulated against a south-facing hillside. The drift was over 15 feet deep at its thickest point, created by weeks of northerly winds pushing snow against the natural barrier. The location was ideal. The hillside protected the drift from further wind erosion. The depth provided plenty of material to work with. And the distance from his cabin meant he could conduct his experiment without completely abandoning his regular shelter. He started digging on December 8th. The work was harder than he anticipated. Snow near the surface was loose and difficult to remove in a controlled way. He fashioned a tool from a flat piece of wood, creating a paddle-shaped implement that let him scoop and compact snow rather than just scattering it. He dug at an angle, sloping downward into the drift, creating a tunnel, approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. The entrance faced east, away from the prevailing winds. After 6 feet of digging, he encountered more compressed snow that held its shape better. The tunnel became easier to excavate once he reached this denser layer. His first attempt at creating an entrance frame failed completely. He tried using a single horizontal pole across the top with no vertical support. When he piled the roof materials over it, the weight caused the entrance to partially collapse inward. He had to dig out the fallen snow and start over with the structural elements. The failure taught him that the entrance needed vertical support to transfer weight downward, not just a horizontal span to hold materials up. His second attempt used a different approach. He cut 2 straight saplings and drove them into the snow on either side of the entrance, creating vertical posts. Then he laid a horizontal beam across the top of the tunnel opening, resting it on the vertical saplings. This created a frame that could support weight from above. He tested it by packing snow on top. The frame held. Next, he gathered materials for the roof covering. He cut small logs and laid them across from the lower beam, spanning outward to create the first layer. Over the logs, he placed branches to fill gaps. Over the branches, he stretched beaver pelts he had been planning to trade. Over the pelts, he packed moss he had gathered from trees near his cabin. Finally, he laid a second horizontal beam on top of everything to compress the layers together and hold them in place. The tunnel extended 23 feet into the drift. At the end, he carved out a slightly larger chamber, just big enough for him to lie down or sit up. He smoothed the walls and ceiling as much as possible. The entire construction took him 9 days of steady work. When he finished, he had created something that looked absurd to anyone who might see it. A small entrance in a snowbank, reinforced with poles and covered with valuable furs, leading to a dark tunnel that went nowhere. The other trappers called it Brennan's Burrow when word spread. They laughed openly about Thomas living like a rabbit. He did not care. On December 17th, he tested it overnight. Thomas brought supplies into the tunnel at dusk on December 17th. He carried 2 wool blankets, dried meat, a water skin, and a candle with matches. He crawled through the entrance and made his way to the interior chamber. The tunnel was completely dark once he moved past the entrance. He lit the candle and examined his work. The walls were smooth and stable. The ceiling showed no signs of sagging or weakness. He extinguished the candle to conserve it and settled in for the night. The darkness was absolute. Thomas wrapped himself in the blankets and waited. The temperature inside the tunnel felt cold, but not brutally so. He estimated it was near freezing, perhaps slightly above. Outside, he knew the temperature had dropped to around -15 degrees. He could hear wind moving across the surface above him, but inside the tunnel, the air was completely still. No wind penetrated. After an hour, he noticed something remarkable. The space around him was warming slightly. His body heat had nowhere to escape. The snow walls absorbed it and reflected it back. He was not warm, but he was no longer getting colder. He spent 13 hours in the tunnel that first night. He dozed intermittently, woke, shifted position, and dozed again. When dawn came, he could see faint light filtering through the entrance. He crawled out into the morning air and immediately felt the difference. Outside was significantly colder than the tunnel interior. He had spent the night in comfort relative to the conditions outside. More importantly, he had used no fire, burned no wood, and created no smoke. The tunnel had kept him alive through passive insulation alone. Over the next week, Thomas refined his design. He noticed that the lower beam across the entrance opening sometimes shifted under the weight of the roof materials. He reinforced it by driving the vertical saplings deeper and angling them slightly outward to create better bracing. He adjusted the roof layers, packing the moss more tightly and adding additional hides where he noticed cold spots. He extended the tunnel another 4 feet, giving himself more space in the interior chamber. He created small shelves in the snow walls where he could store supplies. He carved a ventilation hole near the back of the chamber, just large enough to allow fresh air in while preventing heat loss. The design worked better with each modification. By Christmas, Thomas had a shelter that maintained a consistent internal temperature between 32 and 40 degrees, regardless of outside conditions. He tested it during a cold snap that brought -30-degree temperatures. The tunnel interior stayed at 35 degrees. He could survive indefinitely. In those conditions with adequate food and water, he began moving supplies into the tunnel. Dried meat, smoked fish, flour, coffee, blankets, spare clothing, fire-starting materials as backup. He told no one what he was doing. The mockery from the settlement had made him cautious about sharing his work, but he believed absolutely in what he had created. When truly extreme cold came, his tunnel would save his life. The old-timers started talking about the weather in late December. Men who had spent 20 or 30 years in the mountains developed instincts about winter patterns that went beyond simple observation. They noticed things that younger trappers missed. Samuel Gooding, who had trapped in the territory since 1817, mentioned at the trading post that the animals were behaving strangely. Squirrels had gathered more nuts than usual. Deer were moving to lower elevations earlier than normal. Birds that typically wintered in the valley had flown south weeks ahead of schedule. Gooding said he had seen these signs twice before, both times preceding winters that killed men. William Crawford, who kept detailed weather records, showed Thomas his journal entries from December. The temperature patterns were unusual. Normal winter cold came in cycles. A few days of severe cold followed by a few days of moderate conditions. But December of 1843 showed a steady downward trend with no warming breaks. Each cold period was slightly worse than the last. Crawford said the barometric pressure readings looked wrong. He could not explain exactly what he meant, but something about the numbers troubled him. He predicted January would bring cold beyond anything the current generation of trappers had experienced. The sky itself looked different. On clear days, the sunlight had a peculiar quality, flat and pale. The stars at night seemed sharper and closer. Old-timers said it meant the air was drier than normal, which could indicate Arctic air masses moving south. Marcus Webb's father had trapped in the Northern Territories of Canada before moving to Montana. He told stories about cold snaps that lasted weeks, where temperatures dropped so low that fires barely helped, where men went to sleep and never woke, where entire camps were found months later with frozen bodies still sitting around dead fires. Webb dismissed the stories as exaggerations, but Thomas listened carefully. By New Year's Day of 1844, Thomas had made his decision. He moved most of his essential supplies from his cabin to the snow tunnel. He brought enough food for 3 weeks. He brought all his blankets, spare clothing, his best knife, fire-starting materials, water containers, and even a few books for the isolation he anticipated. He told no one what he was preparing for. When he stopped at the trading post on January 2nd to purchase additional dried meat, Robert Kimball asked if Thomas planned to spend the winter in his rabbit hole. Several men laughed. Thomas said he was simply being cautious. Kimball suggested Thomas should spend more time around people and less time in his snowbank. The implication was clear. They thought his isolation and obsession with snow tunnels indicated a deteriorating mental state. Thomas returned to his cabin that evening. The temperature was already dropping. He banked his cabin fire and locked the door. Then he walked half a mile through the darkness to his tunnel entrance. He crawled inside, arranged his supplies, and settled in to wait. Whatever was coming, he would face it from inside the snow. The temperature dropped below -40 degrees on January 4th. By January 5th, it had reached -52. By January 6th, it hit -62 degrees and stayed there. The cold was unlike anything the Montana Territory had experienced in living memory. Men woke on the morning of January 5th to find their cabin fires had gone out overnight, despite having been well stocked with wood before sleep. The cold had sucked the heat from the fires faster than the wood could burn. Relighting fires became difficult because the extreme cold affected everything. Hands moved slowly. Matches were harder to strike. Even once fires were burning again, they could not heat the cabins adequately. Thomas, inside his snow tunnel, heard none of this directly. He experienced the cold as a slight drop in his tunnel's temperature. The interior went from 38 degrees to 33 degrees over the first 3 days. It stayed at 33 degrees for the remainder of the freeze. He was cold, but not dangerously so. He wore multiple layers of clothing and stayed wrapped in blankets most of the time. He ate dried meat and drank water he had stored in containers that never froze because the tunnel temperature stayed above freezing. He slept 12 to 14 hours per day, conserving energy. During waking hours, he occasionally lit a candle for light to read, but mostly he sat in darkness, thinking, waiting, and monitoring how his body felt. He never felt the bone-deep cold that indicated danger. His fingers and toes remained functional. He never shivered uncontrollably. 3 miles away in the settlement, men were dying. The first death occurred on January 8th. Michael Harrison, a trapper who lived alone in a small cabin, burned through all his firewood by day 4 of the extreme cold. He started burning furniture, his table, his chairs, his sleeping platform. When that ran out, he burned his extra clothes, his leather gear, anything that would catch fire. His neighbors found him on January 9th, frozen solid beside a fire pit filled with ash. He had burned everything he owned and still frozen to death. The other families and trappers fared only slightly better. They rationed their firewood carefully. But the brutal mathematics of the situation became clear quickly. At -60 degrees, even a well-built cabin with a roaring fire could not maintain livable temperatures. The heat escaped through gaps in the logs, through the roof, through the door, through every imperfection in construction. Men kept fires burning constantly and still watched their breath fog inside their cabins. Children developed frostbite on their fingers despite never going outside. Women wrapped themselves and their families in every piece of fabric they owned and still shivered violently. By January 15th, 7 men had died. 12 others had suffered severe frostbite that would cost them fingers, toes, or worse. The survivors huddled together in the trading post, the largest building with the biggest fireplace. They burned wood at a catastrophic rate, tearing apart unused structures to feed the flames. They wondered when the cold would break. They wondered who would survive. And they had no idea that 3 miles away, Thomas Brennan was sleeping comfortably in a tunnel carved from snow. The cold broke on January 22nd. Thomas felt the change even inside his tunnel. The air pressure shifted. The absolute stillness that had characterized the previous 18 days gave way to slight air movement. He waited until midday, then crawled out through the entrance into brilliant sunshine. The temperature had climbed to -10 degrees, which felt almost warm after the prolonged extreme cold. The snow around his tunnel entrance looked exactly as it had when he entered. The structure had held perfectly. Not a single beam had shifted. No collapse had occurred despite the tons of accumulated snow on top. Thomas walked the 3 miles to the settlement. The journey took 2 hours through deep snow. He felt strong and healthy. His fingers worked normally. His feet were warm inside his boots. He had spent 18 days in conditions that he would soon learn had killed 7 men, and he was completely unharmed. When he entered the trading post and asked William Crawford for coffee, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The 15 survivors gathered inside stared at him in disbelief. He looked better than any of them. His face showed color. His movements were normal. He was not shivering or showing any signs of cold exposure. The questions came rapidly. Where had he been? How had he survived? What shelter had protected him? Thomas explained calmly and methodically. He had spent the entire freeze in the snow tunnel he had built in December. The tunnel had maintained a temperature between 32 and 35 degrees throughout the cold. He had used no fire. He had burned no wood. He had simply waited in the insulated space while the extreme cold passed overhead. The men listened with expressions ranging from disbelief to anger. Robert Kimball, who had lost 3 toes to frostbite, demanded to know why Thomas had not told anyone about his shelter. Thomas replied that he had tried to explain his research in December. They had mocked him. They had called it Brennan's Burrow and laughed about him, living like a rabbit. The silence that followed was heavy with realization and regret. Marcus Webb, whose brother Michael had been the first to die, asked if Thomas's tunnel could have saved the others. Thomas said yes, absolutely. A properly built snow tunnel could have saved all 7 men who died and prevented the frostbite injuries the survivors had suffered. The technique required no special materials, just knowledge of snow's insulating properties and basic structural principles. William Crawford asked why Thomas had not forced them to listen. Thomas had no good answer. He had been mocked, dismissed, and isolated. He had stopped trying to convince people who would not listen. The weight of that decision now sat heavily on everyone in the room. Over the following days, Thomas took groups of survivors to see his tunnel. He showed them the 2-beam entrance system, the vertical sapling bracing, the multi-layer roof construction. He explained how depth provided insulation, how body heat alone could maintain survivable temperatures, how the technique required no firewood or continuous maintenance. The men who had called him mad now studied every detail with desperate attention. Within 2 weeks, 5 other trappers had begun building their own snow tunnels for emergency use. Word of Thomas Brennan's snow tunnel spread through the trapping community during the spring of 1844. Trappers traveling through the Montana Territory stopped at the settlement to hear the story firsthand. Some were skeptical until they saw Thomas's tunnel and spoke with the survivors who had lost friends and family during the freeze. The technique began spreading organically, carried by word of mouth along the scattered network of mountain men who moved through the Rockies. By the following winter, trappers in 3 different territories had built emergency snow tunnels based on descriptions of Thomas's design. The tunnels were never meant to replace cabins as primary shelters. They were emergency refuges for extreme conditions, backup systems for when traditional heated structures failed. But that specific purpose made them invaluable. Over the next 2 decades, Thomas's innovation saved an estimated 24 lives. Men caught in unexpected blizzards dug quick versions of the tunnel and survived situations that would have killed them otherwise. Trappers facing prolonged extreme cold used properly constructed tunnels to wait out conditions that made their cabins uninhabitable. The technique became part of the collective knowledge of frontier survival, passed from experienced men to newcomers, refined and adapted to different snow conditions and regional variations. Thomas himself left the mountains in 1851. The fur trade had collapsed completely by then. Beaver populations were depleted, and silk had replaced felt and hat production, destroying the market that had driven the mountain man era. Thomas was 39 years old, had saved a modest amount of money, and was tired of winters. He traveled west to the Oregon Territory and used his carpentry skills to build a small house near the Willamette Valley. He married in 1853, a widow named Catherine, who had lost her first husband during the overland journey west. They had 2 children, both daughters, and Thomas worked as a builder and occasional hunting guide for new settlers. He rarely spoke about his years in the mountains. When people asked about his past, he mentioned trapping beaver and surviving harsh winters, but he never told the story of the snow tunnel or the freeze that broke the valley. His family knew he had been a mountain man, but they knew nothing of the innovation that had saved his life and subsequently saved dozens of others. Thomas died in 1869 at age 57 from pneumonia. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone listed his name, birth and death dates, and identified him as a loving husband and father. It made no mention of Montana, trapping, or snow tunnels. But across the northern Rocky Mountains, the tunnels remained. Some were still maintained by trappers who had learned the technique directly from Thomas. Others were abandoned but structurally sound, waiting in snowbanks for the next emergency. The knowledge Thomas had developed through obsessive observation and desperate necessity had become routine frontier practice. The story teaches what Thomas understood after Jacob's death. Survival in extreme conditions requires abandoning conventional approaches and learning from the environment itself. The impossible became routine, a shelter carved from the enemy itself.